10,000 tons of it. Not in African soil, not in African hands, but buried beneath St. Peter's Basilica, guarded by silence, blessed by men in robes who preached poverty while drowning in stolen gold. At 3:22 a.m., the silence cracked. A dying cardinal whispered the unholy truth. Holy Father, Ibrahim Traoré knows. He confessed what generations had buried 5 centuries of theft, sanctified as faith, hidden as charity. Pope Francis stood in his chamber, trembling. He knew the numbers were real. He knew the vaults existed. What he did not know was that the evidence had already crossed the Mediterranean. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré held the proof. Not rumors, not legends. Proof. Shipping manifests marked with slave blood. Photographs of priests blessing furnaces as Congolese crowns melted. Journals listing gold teeth torn from children's mouths. For 500 years, the Church told Africa it was poor, primitive, in need of salvation. But salvation had a price, and the bill was written in African blood. Now the countdown had begun. 48 hours before the Vatican would be forced to confess or be destroyed by the truth buried in its own vaults. The weight of those words, 10,000 tons, is more than gold. It is centuries of silence, centuries of betrayal, centuries of lies repeated until they sounded holy. The vaults were never empty. Africa was, imagine the scale, a treasure greater than the reserves of most nations, locked beneath the marble floors, where millions of pilgrims walked, whispering prayers above a grave of stolen history. They saw beauty. They heard hymns. They never felt the bones beneath their feet. But Ibrahim Traoré was not a pilgrim. He was a soldier who had become a president, a voice that refused to be silenced. To him, the confession was not revelation, but confirmation. Africa had always known its wealth was gone. Now it had the receipts. This was not only about gold, it was about dignity, about the right to exist without chains disguised as crosses. It was about children growing up hearing that their continent was cursed, when in truth it had been robbed. The Vatican feared scandal. Ibrahim promised justice. He did not beg for recognition. He demanded restitution. 48 hours, not a second longer. History had trained the world to look away, to believe that Africa's wounds were self-inflicted, to accept poverty as natural. But what happens when the curtain is pulled back and the world sees the machinery of theft operating not in shadows but under stained glass? The question was not whether the Vatican had stolen. That was beyond doubt. The question was whether the world would believe Africa when Africa finally spoke for itself. At dawn, St. Peter's Square stood quiet, but the storm had already begun. Screens across Africa glowed with the image of their young leader, the man who had outlasted coups and conspiracies, now standing with documents in his hands that could unravel 5 centuries of deception. And the question hung in the air like thunder. What would break first? The Vatican's silence, or the world's faith? This is where our story begins, with a whisper, in the night that grew into a roar across continents, with a dying man's confession and a young captain's ultimatum, with a secret too heavy to stay buried, because in the end, this is not only a story about gold, it is a story about memory, about truth, about whether the past can ever truly be buried. Stay with me, because what follows is not just history, it is revelation, and once you hear it, you will never see faith, power, or Africa the same way again. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Machines hummed, keeping time with a fading heartbeat. Outside, Rome still slept, its ancient stones unaware that one man's final words would soon shake the foundations of the world's oldest empire. Cardinal Giuseppe Traore, 89 years old, lay dying. For 4 decades, he had been the Vatican's keeper of shadows, the man who carried its darkest secrets without ever flinching. But now, facing eternity, his hands trembled, his lips moved, and the weight of centuries pressed down on his chest heavier than any illness. He had called the Holy Father himself. At 3:22 a.m., the private line in the papal apartments rang, its sound cutting through the stillness. Pope Francis, still in his nightgown, lifted the receiver with weary hands. Jeppy, the voice on the other end was cracked, broken, but sharp enough to cut through the night. Holy Father, he knows. Who knows? Francis whispered. Ibrahim Traoré, came the reply, rasped between gasps for breath. The gold, all 10,000 tons, every ounce we ever hid. He has the documents. He has the codes. 48 hours. Holy Father, 48 hours before he tells the world. The Pope's heart pounded. His hand shook so violently he nearly dropped the phone. 10,000 tons. The figure echoed in his mind like a curse. He had heard it before, in closed sessions, in whispers around the apostolic palace, but never so bluntly, never so fatally. Jeppy, you cannot. I have. The cardinal cut him off. His voice carried the calm of a man already stepping into eternity. I could not meet God with this sin still on my lips. I confessed. To him, to Africa, to justice. Francis pressed his forehead against the cold glass of his window, staring out at the darkened dome of St. Tudor. Peters, do you know what you've done? Yes. Touretti's breathing grew shallow. I've told the truth. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, another room was filled with a different kind of silence. Ibrahim Traoré sat at a heavy wooden desk, papers spread before him like weapons. His closest aides gathered, each face drawn with the gravity of history unfolding in real time. Dr. Aminata Sawado, his historical advisor, lifted one folder, her eyes fierce. Shipping manifests, she said. Slave ships disguised as missionary aid. Their holds packed, not only with bodies, but with gold. Ransoms paid in metal and called donations. Oh, where? She opened another file. Photographs from the 1,960 seconds. Priests in cassocks melting artifacts from the Kingdom of Congo into bars, blessing the furnaces with holy water. Her hand hesitated before the last item. A leather-bound journal, old, cracked, stained by the sweat of a guilty man. This, she whispered, is Touretti's own record. Vault inventories, access codes, notes on every shipment. 10,473 tons, plus artifacts beyond counting. Captain Marcus Zongo, head of presidential security, leaned forward, his jaw tight. He also revealed something else. The Vatican has used this gold as collateral. European banks, their entire stability, partially rests on African gold, stolen and hidden under Rome. The words hung in the room like smoke. Traore rose, walking to the window, the city lights flickering below. He clenched his fists. So it is not just history. It is still happening. They are still feeding on us. Foreign Minister Ouedraogo cleared his throat. What is your plan? Mr. President. Traore turned, eyes burning with the fire of generations denied justice. We give them what the cardinal demanded. 48 hours. Confess publicly. Return everything. If they refuse, he laid his hand on the mountain of documents. We release it all, and the world will finally see what Christianity has been built on. Back in Rome, the Pope ended the call and collapsed into his chair, his face pale as the marble beneath his feet. For centuries, the Vatican had survived storms, emperors, wars, scandals. But this was different. This was not accusation. This was evidence. The clock struck 4. He closed his eyes and prayed. But even as the words left his lips, he knew heaven would not answer. The world would, and far to the south, in Africa, a young captain held the key to that reckoning. But Ibrahim was not holding a confession. He was holding proof. Beneath the world's most famous church, past marble corridors polished by centuries of pilgrims, lies a darkness the faithful were never meant to see. 5 levels below St. Peter's Basilica, past locked gates and coded doors, stretches the hidden stomach of the Holy See. Cold air presses in. Silence hums like a wound. This is no treasury. This is a tomb of stolen souls. Rows of gold bars line the walls, stacked higher than a man. Their surfaces dull from time, but still burning with history. Each bar gleams like a mirror, yet in its reflection, one can almost see the villages razed. The children sold, the kingdoms brought to dust. To the Vatican. These are assets. To Africa. They are headstones. In Cardinal Traoré's journal, the descriptions are chilling in their precision. Vault 1. Ceremonial medals. He wrote. The list included crowns from the Congo hammered flat, the royal regalia of Benin smelted into ingots, chalices taken from Ethiopian monasteries and stripped of their crosses before the fire. Each line item reads like a death sentence disguised as inventory. There are photographs, hidden until now, black and white images of priests standing beside furnaces, lifting their hands in blessing while ancient artifacts melt into liquid gold. One picture shows a crown placed upon an anvil, the priest smiling as the hammer falls. Another shows children's bangles being poured into a crucible, their shapes dissolving into nothing but anonymous metal. Beneath one image, a handwritten caption, sanctified before storage. The deeper levels are worse. Cabinets stretch endlessly, filled with labeled boxes. A drawer marked Congo. 1902 contains gold teeth pulled from slaves. Another, Sudan, 1898, holds baptismal chains taken from children as payment for salvation. The air is heavy, not from dust, but from ghosts. These are not collections. They are confessions in metal and bone. Above ground, tourists wander the Basilica, gazing up at Michelangelo's dome, whispering prayers, lighting candles. They marvel at painted ceilings, while directly under their feet lie the melted faces of their ancestors' victims. They kneel before altars of marble while 5 floors below, gold stripped from Africa, wait silently in the dark. Even popes have walked these halls. Francis himself descended once, escorted by bankers and cardinals, shown the vaults as if they were heritage. He remembered the smell of cold iron, the endless corridors, the way the echo of his footsteps felt like accusations. He had been told it was sacred trust, wealth, safeguarded for the church. Yet when he touched one bar, he swore it burned colder than ice. He had not returned since. The vaults are not only relics of theft, they are the beating heart of power. Captain Marcus Zongo had explained it bluntly when reading Traoré's notes. Collateral stock. These bars back European banks. Their stability rests on our suffering. Every loan, every bailout, every European fortune anchored to African blood gold hidden beneath Rome. The words are more damning than the photographs. For centuries, Europe declared Africa poor, unfit, in need of aid. Yet their prosperity was mortgaged to vaults filled with stolen wealth. The illusion of civilization above ground was financed by the barbarism beneath it. Imagine the irony. Pilgrims shuffle across the basilica floor, rosaries in hand, heads bowed in humility. Their whispers rise like incense, but each step falls above a vault heavier than their prayers. They seek salvation in God's house, never knowing God's house is built on the melted bones of another people's faith. Cardinal Traoré wrote in his final entry, "Every bar baptized, every ounce absolved, but weight does not confess. Weight only waits." He knew the vaults were not a record of generosity, but a record of genocide. The true cathedral of the Vatican is not the dome of St. Peter's, it is the labyrinth of gold beneath it. A monument not to Christ, but to conquest. The basilica above shines in the morning light, but below lies the permanent midnight of history. And yet, the Vatican wasn't just hoarding, it was still profiting. Ouagadougou did not sleep easily. Even at night, the city hummed with restless energy, a mixture of old wounds and young defiance. In the presidential compound, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone at his desk, the dim light casting long shadows across the files spread before him. The clock ticked past midnight, but his eyes did not waver. He had stared at battle maps once, preparing for ambushes in the Sahel. Now he stared at something far heavier than war. Proof. Proof that his ancestors had not been poor, but robbed. Proof that his people's humiliation had not been destiny, but design. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under the weight of memory. Ibrahim had been born in a dusty village, where children shared hunger more often than bread. His earliest memory was of his mother boiling stones in a pot to trick them into sleep, whispering, "Tomorrow we eat." Tomorrow rarely came. At school, European textbooks told him Africa was underdeveloped, that salvation came from missionaries, that progress came from Paris, Rome, London. But he had felt, even as a boy, the sting of those lies. As a young soldier, he saw the Sahel torn apart by warlords funded with foreign weapons, smuggling gold and uranium out of the land while villages starved. Buried comrades watched mothers wail over sons killed by militias, whose paymasters smiled in European banks. Every battle whispered the same truth. Africa was not cursed. Africa was crucified. When the coup swept him into power, the world mocked him as a boy soldier, an upstart, but the people cheered. They saw in him something they had not seen in decades. Defiance. A leader who did not bow, who did not beg, who spoke the forbidden words. Africa does not need charity. Africa needs justice. And now, on his desk, lay the chance to prove it. Dr. Aminata Sawado stood silently by the window, her eyes fixed on the files. She had studied history all her life, piecing together fragments, stolen or burned. For her, these documents were vindication. It was never myths, she said softly. The archives we suspected, the whispers of melted crowns, the erased kingdoms, it is all here. Captain Marcus Zongo, broad-shouldered and stern, tapped one folder. And more than history, Mr. President, this is war. These bars back their banks. If we reveal this, Europe trembles. Ibrahim rose slowly, his uniform crisp but unbuttoned at the collar. He walked to the window, looking out at the faint glow of the sleeping city. Beyond the rooftops lay the Sahel, endless and scarred, yet stubbornly alive. His voice was low, but steady. So for centuries, they called us beggars. While sitting on our gold, they starved us to fatten their banks. They told us to pray while they melted our gods into bars. He turned, eyes blazing. This is not just restitution. This is revolution. Foreign Minister Ouedraogo cleared his throat, cautious but firm. If we release it all at once, the shock will be catastrophic. Economies will collapse. Allies will turn. We may invite assassinations, invasions. Ibrahim raised a hand. And if we stay silent, what then? Another 500 years of lies. He slammed his fist on the desk, the files trembling like frightened birds. No, the world must see, not as myth, not as rumor, but as proof. We give them what the cardinal asked of us. 48 hours. If they confess, perhaps the church can be saved. If they refuse, he paused, his voice like steel, then let it burn under the weight of its own gold. The room was silent. Outside, a faint call to prayer echoed across the city, mingling with the hum of insects in the warm night. It was a sound older than Rome, older than cathedrals, older than conquest. It was the voice of a continent refusing to die. Ibrahim lifted the leather journal, the cardinal's trembling handwriting still visible on its stained pages. He held it as though it were not just a record, but a weapon. Perhaps it was both. His lips moved in a whisper. No one else heard. For you, Mother. For you, Father. For all of us. The aides watched as he set the journal down gently, as though laying a cornerstone. Then he looked at each of them in turn, his eyes unwavering. The countdown has begun, he said, and in that moment, the weight of centuries shifted, if only slightly, from Africa's shoulders onto Rome's. The countdown had already begun. 48 hours. The bells of St. Peter's had not yet rung for morning mass when the apostolic palace filled with hurried footsteps, doors slammed, slippers scuffed against marble, crimson robes thrown over nightclothes. Rome still slept. But inside the Vatican, the most powerful men of the Catholic Church gathered in haste, their faces pale, their voices raw. It was 6 o'clock when Pope Francis entered the council chamber. His white robe hung loosely, the lines of sleeplessness etched deep around his eyes. He did not bless the room. He simply sat, hands folded. As the storm broke around him, "Your Holiness, this is madness." Cardinal Antonio Benedetti, head of the Vatican Bank, slammed his fist on the table. "We cannot dignify such blackmail with a response. A boy soldier from Africa will not dictate the fate of the Church." Across the table, Cardinal Michael O'Brien of Ireland leaned forward, his voice cutting. "With respect, Antonio, this boy has already toppled governments. He exposed France's colonial crimes, forced Paris to its knees. Do you think Rome will fare better? Lies. Benedetti spat, his face red. Fabrications designed to humiliate us. We deny, and the world will believe us." But the silence that followed betrayed the truth. Everyone in that chamber knew denial would not survive evidence. And the evidence was in Ibrahim's hands. Francis finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "He has documents, photographs, codes. I heard it from Touretti's own mouth. He confessed before God, before death." Murmurs erupted. Some in disbelief, others in anger. One cardinal clutched his crucifix, as though it could shield him from the words. Another scribbled notes furiously, as if writing could undo reality. A younger voice broke through, Cardinal Alvarez from Mexico, barely 60, eyes burning with conviction. "Then perhaps we must confess as well. If we cling to silence, we prove him right. If we speak, perhaps we save faith. Confess." Benedetti's laughter was harsh. "Confess to stealing Africa's wealth for half a millennium. You would destroy the Church yourself. It is already destroyed." O'Brien shot back. "Can you not feel it? The walls are shaking. The faithful are watching. Denial will not save us. Only truth might." The room splintered into factions. Conservatives rallied behind Benedetti, voices raised, fists pounding the table. Liberals clustered around O'Brien, whispering of moral duty. Moderates swayed between them, torn by fear. The chamber became a battlefield, not of swords, but of words. Every sentence a weapon. Through it all, Francis sat motionless, staring at the crucifix on the wall. He thought of Christ's words about wealth and poverty, about truth and hypocrisy. What would Christ say now, if he were to walk these halls and see the treasure beneath their feet? Finally, Francis asked the question that hung over them all. His voice was almost a whisper, yet it silenced the room. "How much do we have?" Benedetti hesitated. His lips parted, then closed again. He shifted in his chair, his hand trembling slightly. For years he had been the keeper of numbers, the man who could conjure figures with ease. Now the number felt like poison in his mouth. Francis repeated, firmer this time. "How much?" The chamber waited, breathless. Even the air seemed to hold still. When Benedetti finally spoke, his voice cracked. 10,000. 473 tons. Plus artefact, tens of thousands. Immeasurable value. The words struck the room like thunder. Several cardinals crossed themselves instinctively, as if the number itself were a blasphemy. One man whispered a prayer. Another covered his face with his hands. Francis leaned back, his eyes closing. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than the dome of St. Peter's. And then, softly, but unmistakably, he asked the final question. "And how much came from Africa?" Benedetti swallowed, his throat dry. His reply was almost a whisper, yet it cut sharper than any shout. "All of it. Your Holiness. Every single ounce." The chamber fell into a silence, so absolute it felt like judgment itself. The figure was whispered, "Sir, 473 tons." Silence fell. Ibrahim Traoré did not rush. In war, the first bullet is never wasted. In politics, the first revelation must wound deeper than any weapon. He sat in his office, surrounded by his closest advisors, the files heavy on the table between them. Everyone expected him to unleash everything at once. Documents, videos, codes, inventories. Instead, Ibrahim chose one photograph, one image sharp enough to pierce the illusion of holiness. It was dated 1963, black and white, grainy but unmistakable. In the center, a group of Vatican officials stood around a furnace. The fire glowed white-hot. At the edge of the frame, African artifacts from the Kingdom of Congo. A crown, a mask, a chalice waited their turn to be destroyed. A priest, hand raised, blessed the flames as a golden statue melted into liquid metal. Beneath the photo, Ibrahim's team added only a single caption. They melted our ancestors' art and called it God's work. At dawn, the image appeared on every major social media platform simultaneously. Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp groups from Lagos to London. Within minutes, it was everywhere. Within an hour, it was unstoppable. The hashtag Vatican Gold rose to the top of global trends, faster than any protest, faster than any celebrity scandal. In Lagos, young Nigerians filled the streets, waving printed copies of the photograph above their heads. In Kinshasa, priests refused to open churches, declaring themselves unable to preach while the picture burned in their minds. In Mexico City, students projected the image onto the walls of their cathedral. In Dublin, survivors of colonial oppression gathered silently outside their churches, holding candles that flickered in the cold morning air. The Vatican's phones rang without pause. Bishops across Africa demanded answers. Parishioners wept in confessionals, asking priests why the church had lied. Journalists camped outside the apostolic palace, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Father Federico Lombardi, the Vatican's press spokesman, tried to smother the fire. By noon, he stood before the cameras, his hands folded, his face calm. "This photograph is fabricated," he declared. "It is an attempt to damage the Holy Church. We categorically deny these baseless accusations." But the denial came too late. The image had already entered history. The world did not see fabrication. The world saw truth, or at least a truth too believable to ignore. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim watched the press conference on a flickering monitor. He said nothing. His eyes were steady, his hands resting on the files that held far worse than a photograph. Dr. Aminata Sawado leaned toward him. "They call it fabricated. Do we answer?" Ibrahim shook his head. "No. We wait. Denial is the noose. Evidence is the drop. Let them tighten it themselves." By evening, the protests had grown. St. Peter's Square filled with thousands, holding signs painted with the photograph, chanting for the truth. The Swiss guards, usually stiff as statues, shifted nervously at their posts. For the first time in living memory, the square did not feel like holy ground. It felt like a battlefield. Inside, Pope Francis met again with his cardinals. Their voices clashed, desperation spilling into rage. "It is fake," one insisted. "The faithful will not believe it." But O'Brien, his Irish voice grim, answered coldly, "They already believe it. That is enough. This is no longer about faith. It is about survival." Francis closed his eyes. He had seen the photograph. He knew the basement chambers. He knew the smell of the furnaces. To call it fabrication was to lie not only to the world, but to himself. By nightfall, news anchors from New York to Nairobi opened their broadcasts with the same question: what is the Vatican hiding? And in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim prepared the next move. He lifted another file, thicker than the first, his jaw set. The photograph had been a warning shot. The real bombardment had yet to come. 47 hours remained. When the Vatican dismissed the first photograph as forgery, Ibrahim did not argue. He did not protest. He simply gave the world something it could not deny: a voice. The video was dated 1987. Grainy, flickering, but unmistakably real. The camera followed a procession through stone corridors deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Torches on the wall cast jagged shadows, illuminating faces half-lit by fire. At the front walked Cardinal Traoré, younger then, but recognizable, his voice echoing off the cold stone. "Gentlemen," he said in Italian, his tone calm, almost proud, "you are about to see 5 centuries of faith transformed into collateral the Lord provides for his church. And Africa has been generous." The bankers behind him chuckled uneasily, their polished shoes tapping on ancient steps. Keys jingled. A door groaned open. The view widened into a chamber lined with bars of gold, stacked higher than a man's head, each bar stamped with origin: Congo, 1889; Ethiopia, 1937; Ghana, 1954. One Swiss banker's voice trembled with awe. 500 years of African gold. And Traoré answered without hesitation. Indeed, the faithful donations of converted souls. The tape cut to static. No narration, no commentary, just images and voices. But it was enough. Within an hour, the footage was everywhere. On satellite news, on WhatsApp chains, on giant screens in Lagos, Nairobi, São Paulo. Anchors replayed it endlessly, their voices tight with shock. No one spoke of fabrication now. No one dared. In Lagos, thousands poured into the streets, holding up their phones with the video looping, chanting, "Return it! Return it!" In Kinshasa, priests laid down their vestments and walked out of churches, leaving altars deserted. In Mexico City, protesters surrounded the cathedral, demanding bishops explain themselves. In Dublin, old women wept openly outside stone chapels, whispering, "We trusted them. We trusted them." The Vatican's denial collapsed overnight. The first to act was the Archbishop of Lagos, standing before cameras. His voice shook, but his words cut like steel. "I cannot serve a church that prays above vaults filled with the blood of my ancestors." He tore off his mitre and left it on the pulpit. Hours later, the Cardinal of Kinshasa followed. "We told our people to trust in God, but God's house trusted in gold." Resignations rippled across the continent. Masses were cancelled, churches emptied, collection plates returned, untouched. And it did not stop at Africa. In Brazil, where enslaved Africans had built churches stone by stone, Catholics remembered their own stolen past. In Chile, where indigenous Mapuche gold had long since vanished, students painted "Thieves of God" across cathedral doors. In Ireland, memories of famine and empire reawakened. Parishioners marched silently, holding bread in one hand, broken chains in the other. Rome itself shook. For the first time in centuries, St. Peter's Square filled not with pilgrims but with protesters, candles raised, their chants echoing off the Basilica's dome. Truth, truth, truth. Inside, Pope Francis sat in his chamber, with the video on repeat. He knew that corridor, he knew that vault. He remembered the smell of damp stone, the metallic bite of furnaces. He could almost hear the bars clink against each other. Watching Traoré's face, he felt a shiver crawl up his spine. This was no trick of enemies. This was the church itself, captured in its own words. The cardinals raged in the council chamber. "It can be dismissed," shouted one. "It is selective editing," cried another. But their phones buzzed with resignation letters, furious emails from bishops, desperate calls from parishes collapsing in hours. Cardinal O'Brien, pale but resolute, stood. "The game is over. The lie is dead. The world has seen the vault. The church cannot unsee it." Benedetti slammed the table, his fury unmasked. "Then we fight. Deny until the last breath." "The last breath," O'Brien answered coldly, "is already upon us." Outside, the sound of bells filled the night. Not the measured peal of prayer, but the chaotic ringing of alarm. In African cities, churches tolled their bells in mourning, as if for a funeral. In Europe, some priests rang them in defiance. In South America, crowds took the ropes themselves, pulling until the towers shook. The sound carried across continents, the sound of faith breaking. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim watched the uproar unfold on screen. His advisors sat in silence, knowing history was unfolding before them. "Dr. Sawada whispered, almost reverently, "It is no longer their secret. It belongs to the world now." Captain Zongo leaned forward, fists tight, "And the world cannot look away. Not anymore." Ibrahim said nothing. He did not smile. He did not gloat. His gaze was steady, fixed on the files that held the next strike. The photograph had cracked the facade. The video had shattered it. But the heaviest blow was still waiting. And Ibrahim was not done yet. The church had survived scandals before. Priests caught in abuse, corruption in its banks, even whispers of murder. But never had its foundations cracked like this. This was not gossip. This was not accusation. This was proof, recorded in its own voice. And the faithful, for centuries, patient and forgiving, rose like a tide. In Lagos, the cathedral doors were locked, but worshippers came anyway. They gathered in the square, thousands of them, holding candles in silence. Then, without a word spoken, one man stepped forward and nailed a printed still from the video to the wooden door. Beneath it, he wrote in red paint, "Return what you stole." Others followed, posting photographs, handwritten letters, broken rosaries. By dawn, the cathedral doors were buried under paper and fire. In Kinshasa, entire choirs walked out mid-mass. They laid their hymn books on the altar and marched into the streets, singing, not in Latin but in Lingala, songs of resistance, songs of ancestors. Priests tried to stop them, but the people sang louder, drowning out the bells. In São Paulo, parishioners carried empty bowls into the cathedral, holding them aloft as the priest spoke. "You told us Christ fed the hungry," one man shouted, "but you feasted on our gold while we starved." The bowls clattered against marble as hundreds dropped them at the altar and walked away. Even in Rome, the rebellion took root. In Trastevere, a young woman scaled the steps of a local church and draped a black cloth over the statue of the Virgin Mary. "She weeps," she cried, her voice echoing, "not for sinners, but for the lies of men." Soon, every statue in the district was veiled in mourning. Tourists stared. Priests gaped. The message was undeniable. The sacred had been defiled by gold. The Vatican tried to resist. Father Lombardi returned to the press room, his words trembling though his voice sought calm. We urge the faithful to remain strong. These revelations are being weaponized against Christ's church. Do not lose faith. But the faithful had already decided. In Dublin, parishioners stormed a church after Sunday Mass. They carried out golden chalices, crucifixes, candlesticks not to steal, but to pile them in the street. They poured petrol, struck a match, and watched them melt into blackened ash. If it is made from blood, one man said, then it is not holy. In Nairobi, young Catholics cut their membership cards into pieces live on television, declaring, "We belong to God, not to thieves." The broadcast reached every home, every phone. Within days, Catholic identity cards across the continent were being torn, burned, buried. Even within the clergy, rebellion grew. Nuns in Madrid chained themselves to the gates of their convent, banners above them reading, "We took vows of poverty, return the gold." In Mexico, priests held open-air services, refusing to enter their churches until the Vatican confessed. For the first time in living memory, the Catholic Church faced not enemies from outside, but rebellion from within. Not governments, not laws, but its own believers tearing themselves away. And in the midst of it all, the younger generation led, teenagers with smartphones, streaming protests live, university students projecting the video onto church walls, choirs remixing Latin hymns with chants of protest, their songs spreading faster than sermons ever had. The Vatican tried again. A new statement, more denial, promises of investigation. But no one listened. The world had already seen the truth. Pope Francis walked through the papal apartments at night, the chants from St. Peter's Square drifting through the windows. Return it, return it. He pressed his hands together, whispering prayers that felt like dust. The crucifix on his wall seemed heavier now, not a symbol of salvation, but a reminder of betrayal. For the first time in his papacy, Francis felt not like the shepherd of souls, but the defendant in a trial older than his church. By the second week, the numbers were undeniable. Mass attendance across Africa had dropped by 90%. Latin America followed swiftly. Even Europe saw a collapse. Pews empty, confessionals silent, donation baskets abandoned. Priests stood before empty benches, their voices echoing in hollowness. The faith was not dead. The faith was furious. And all the while, Ibrahim held back the deadliest proof. It was not an ordinary speech. It was not politics. It was judgment. On the second Sunday after the video had torn the church open, the world gathered not in a square, not in a stadium, but before television screens, radios, phones, from New York to Nairobi, from Paris to Pretoria. The broadcast was everywhere. The United Nations suspended its session to watch. CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC cleared their schedules. The Vatican sealed its windows. And then he appeared. Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, stood at a lectern, not draped in flags, but backed by a vast screen. On it was a map of Africa, scarred with red lines stretching north, across the Sahara, across the Mediterranean, ending in Rome. Arrows marked centuries of plunder, ports, mission stations, slave routes, and finally, Vatican City. He wore no medals, no grand robes, only a dark suit, a plain tie. His hands rested on a thick leather folder. His voice, when it came, was calm, steady, yet it carried the weight of centuries. For 500 years, he began, Africa was told it was poor, that it was primitive, that it needed salvation from across the sea. But the truth is this: Africa was robbed. Salvation came holding a Bible in one hand and a furnace in the other. Our ancestors' crowns were melted into bars. Our children's jewelry was stripped for ransom. Our king's treasures were locked beneath Rome, while our villages starved. He opened the folder, revealing pages of documents, manifests, receipts, photographs. This is not myth. This is not rumor. This is evidence. Every ounce of gold, every artifact, every theft. The Vatican did not build its empire on faith. It built it on African blood. He raised a single sheet, his fingers steady. Here, shipping logs from 1789, recording Congolese gold, loaded onto slave ships marked as donations. Here, photographs from 1963 of priests blessing a furnace as African masks melted. Here, a ledger in the hand of Cardinal Traoré himself, listing the current contents of the vaults. 10,473 tons of gold, every ounce from Africa, every artifact stolen. Gasps rippled through the press room. Reporters scribbled furiously. The broadcast carried those gasps into living rooms, bars, mosques, cathedrals. Ibrahim's Gaza hardened. And it is not only theft of the past. This gold has been used as collateral for European banks. The very financial system that controls your lives is built on the bones of my ancestors. The Vatican's vaults are not holy. They are collateral. The camera panned slightly, revealing beside him a simple wooden cross, hand-carved by a craftsman in Burkina Faso. Ibrahim gestured toward it. This cross is worth more than all their gold, because it was given freely. It was made with love, not stolen with blood. That is the difference between faith and theft. His tone shifted, colder now. The Vatican has 48 hours to confess publicly, to open its vaults, to return every ounce of gold, every artifact, every stolen crown and chalice. If they do, perhaps the church may find redemption. If they refuse, he paused, letting the silence stretch until the air itself seemed to tremble. Then we will release everything, every document, every photograph, every secret they have buried for 5 centuries. And the world will see what Christianity was built on. He closed the folder. The sound echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. I am not asking for charity. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am demanding justice. Africa does not need aid. Africa needs its gold returned, its history restored, its dignity recognized. The time for silence is over. The time for truth is now. He stepped back from the lectern. New questions. No negotiations. The broadcast cut to black. Across the world, silence followed. Not the silence of ignorance, but of shock. In bars, men dropped their glasses. In churches, women covered their faces. In schools, children stared at screens with wide eyes. In Rome, the bells of St. Peter's rang for noon, but for the first time, their sound was drowned out by the countdown echoing in every ear. 48 hours. And in Rome, the countdown clock began to tick louder than the bells of St. Peter's. The world did not sleep that night. Ibrahim's ultimatum thundered across continents like a drumbeat of judgment. 48 hours. Confess, or collapse. In Africa, joy and dread mingled in equal measure. In Ouagadougou, crowds filled the streets, waving banners painted with gold crowns and broken chains. Some danced, shouting, "Justice is coming." Others knelt in prayer, terrified of what retaliation might follow. Mothers held their children close, whispering, "Remember this night. Remember when Africa finally spoke." In Lagos, giant screens replayed Ibrahim's speech on a loop. Every pause, every sentence, every demand echoed through the city like prophecy. Elderly men, who had lived their whole lives believing poverty was Africa's fate, wept openly. "We were never poor," one whispered, touching the ground. "We were robbed." In Europe, panic spread faster than fire. Banks convened emergency meetings behind closed doors. Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, the Bank of England all had one question on their lips. What happens if the collateral is gone? Traders stared at their screens as gold prices spiked. Markets convulsed. Currencies trembled. The euro faltered. The dollar shivered. In Paris, the French president addressed his cabinet with a pale face. If he releases everything, he said, France will be implicated too. Our colonial crimes, our museum treasures, our banks. It will not stop at the Vatican. Ministers shifted in their seats, realizing Ibrahim's ultimatum was not only Rome's problem, it was Europe's. In Washington, the State Department tried to play it cool. We will not be blackmailed by an African populist, one official sneered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Analysts knew the truth. If the Vatican's collateral was exposed, even the U.S. Federal Reserve might be stained. The Vatican itself was a fortress of fear. Francis paced his chambers, rosary clutched in trembling hands. He had prayed before, but never like this. Each bead felt heavy, as though carved from stolen gold. In the council chamber, cardinals bickered until their voices cracked. We must deny, Your Holiness, Benedetti thundered, slamming the table. Confession mine ruin. And denial means war with truth itself, O'Brien retorted, his Irish accent sharp as a blade. Look outside, Saint. Peter's is filled with our own faithful demanding answers. Will you call them liars too? Moderates begged for compromise. Conservative demanded silence. Progressives demanded confession. And Francis sat between them, head bowed, torn in two. Meanwhile, the protests swelled. In Kinshasa, believers occupied churches, chanting until priests fled. In Madrid, nuns marched in the streets, their banners reading, "Return what is not ours." In Mexico City, Catholic youth chained themselves to cathedral gates, refusing to move until the Vatican responded. The media turned merciless. Every newspaper carried Ibrahim's words on the front page. The Vatican's 48 hours. Talk shows replayed his calm face, dissecting every phrase. Headlines screamed, "Truth or collapse." At the United Nations, African delegates demanded an emergency session. "This is not blackmail," thundered Ghana's ambassador. "This is history knocking on the door of justice." Even some European diplomats stayed silent, unwilling to defend Rome too loudly. By the second night, even the Vatican's allies began to falter. Insurance companies whispered of liabilities too great to cover. Banks hinted they might freeze Vatican accounts unless the issue was resolved. Politicians who once sought the Church's blessing now sought distance. And through it all, Ibrahim remained silent. No new release. No press conference. Only the clock ticking towards zero. The world expected more evidence at any moment. Yet, none came. That silence was its own weapon, heavier than any speech. Francis stared at his reflection in a window overlooking St. Statue, Peter's Square. Thousands stood below, their chants rising. Confess, confess, confess. His face in the glass looked older, smaller, crushed by centuries of sin. He whispered to himself, "Lord, what do you ask of me now?" The answer did not come. Only the tolling of the bells, heavy and hollow, like a countdown, marking not hours but centuries. And still, Ibrahim had not played his final card. It did not come from Ouagadougou. It did not come from Ibrahim. It came from Rome itself. At midnight, while the Vatican slept fitfully, Italian journalists at La Repubblica received an anonymous email. Attached were scanned ledgers, photographs, coded inventories. Within minutes, editors realized what they were holding: the complete vault record. By dawn, the front page screamed, "Sur 473 tons Vatican's African gold exposed." The documents were devastating not in numbers alone, But in detail, every page was a confession written in ink long before Ibrahim had spoken. Page 1. San, 000 tons, from West African kingdoms. Sized 1400, 1600. Page 14. R, 000 tons from Congo. Extracted during Leopold's terror. 1885. 1908. Page 27. E, 500 tons from Ethiopian churches. Looted during Mussolini's invasion. 1935. 41. Page 39. Gold teeth from slave populations. Melted and stored. 1,700. 1,800. The descriptions were worse than the weights. Beside each figure, notes scribbled by Vatican treasurers. Royal crown melted 1,623. Children's jewelry, accepted as baptism payment. Artifacts destroyed to erase pagan memory. It read less like a ledger and more like a crime scene inventory, spanning 5 centuries. By breakfast, Italian newsstands were empty. Citizens clutched papers in silence on buses, trains, piazzas. Some wept openly. Some cursed. Some stared blankly, as though the city itself had turned to ash. Within hours, prosecutors in Rome opened investigations. The EU Parliament convened emergency hearings. Swiss banks issued denials that convinced no one. Television anchors' voices cracked as they read aloud the entries. Gold teeth from slaves. The words hung in the air, like smoke from a battlefield. In Africa, celebrations erupted and grief followed close behind. In Accra, people danced in the streets. In Kinshasa, families carried portraits of ancestors lost to colonial wars. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim's aides rushed into his office with copies of the Italian newspaper. "Mr. President, the world has the list," Captain Zongo said, breathless. Ibrahim looked down at the pages. His jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the figures he already knew. He said nothing for a long while. Then quietly, "Now the evidence no longer belongs to us. It belongs to everyone. In Rome, chaos deepened." Francis held the paper in trembling hands, the ink smudging his fingertips. He had known the numbers. He had seen the vaults, but to see them laid bare on cheap newsprint was something else. It was as if the sins of centuries had been nailed to every wall in the city. His cardinals stormed the papal chamber. "Who leaked this?" "Benedetti Traoré," his face purple. "This is treason." O'Brien's voice was quieter, but sharper. Perhaps it was providence. Perhaps the truth cannot be caged forever. Suspicion hung heavy. Some whispered of disloyal staff, others of disillusioned priests. But the unspoken thought lingered. Perhaps Francis himself had loosened the seal. Perhaps, in despair, he had let the truth slip through his own trembling fingers. The Pope said nothing. He simply folded the paper and placed it on his desk, as though surrendering to it. Outside, St. Peter's Square swelled again. Protesters held newspapers above their heads like banners. Some read aloud the inventory through megaphones, each item greeted with gasps, sobs, shouts. 3,000 tons from West Africa. Shame. Gold teeth from slaves. Murderers. The bells rang, but their toll was drowned out by human voices. In London, the Bank of England faced a storm. Letters between the Vatican and British officials surfaced, already hinted at in the leak. One line in particular spread across social media. His Holiness's blessing transforms Negro gold into Christian wealth. The words went viral. Shame, searing across Britain like fire. Markets collapsed. Gold spiked. The euro tumbled. The dollar shivered. Banks clutched at credibility that slipped like sand between their fingers. And Ibrahim, he remained silent. For once, He had released nothing, but his silence was louder than words. The world assumed he had orchestrated the leak. He let them believe it. In truth, he had not. And that was more dangerous still, because if the truth could break free without him, then the Vatican no longer faced one man's ultimatum. It faced the weight of history itself, untethered, unstoppable. Francis knew it too. Alone in his chambers, he whispered into the dark, "Perhaps this is your hand, Lord. Perhaps this is the judgment we cannot escape." The truth was no longer Ibrahim's weapon. It was everywhere. The apostolic palace no longer felt like a sanctuary. Its marble gleamed as always. Its frescoes told the same painted stories. Yet, to Pope Francis, the walls seemed to press inward, suffocating. The palace had once been a fortress of faith. Now it felt like a prison built on lies. The leak had shattered the last illusions. The world had read the numbers, seen the ledgers, gasped at the grotesque entries. 10,473 tons of African gold. Gold teeth from slaves. Children's bracelets listed as baptismal offerings. Crowns melted into anonymity. The details spread like wildfire. No denial could put out the flames. Francis had not slept for 2 nights. His bed stood untouched. He sat instead by a narrow window, staring at the square below. St. Peter's, once a place of pilgrimage, now throbbed with anger. By candlelight, thousands gathered every night. Some kneeled in prayer, some shouted until their voices broke. Placards rose like daggers. Return the gold. Truth, not silence. Christ did not steal. The chanting surged up to his chamber, refusing to be drowned out even by the bells. Inside, the College of Cardinals was tearing itself apart. Benedetti led the charge, his voice raw with fury. "We must denounce it all as fabrication. The African president is blackmailing us. The papers are forged. The photographs doctored. We hold firm and survive." His fist slammed the table. Rattling crystal glasses. O'Brien shot back, his Irish cadence sharp as iron. "Do you still think survival is possible? Look outside. Listen. The faithful are no longer with us. Denial now is suicide," with slower breath. Others wavered in between. Some proposed controlled regret, a carefully worded apology that admitted errors of history but not outright theft. One trembling old cardinal whispered of seeking asylum abroad, fearing mobs might one day storm the Vatican itself. The chamber seethed with fear. Robes rustled as men shifted in their seats, sweat beading on foreheads. Crucifixes clutched like shields. Once they had been princes of the church. Now they were frightened courtiers in a collapsing empire. Francis sat among them, his hands wrapped around a rosary wound too tight. The beads dug into his skin, leaving faint red marks, as though branding him with the weight of centuries. He remembered Christ's words. "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world, yet lose his soul? Had the church not gained the world gold, land, power, and sold its soul in return?" Memory assaulted him. He recalled visiting a favela in Brazil, kneeling in a shack where a mother cradled a dying child. She had nothing but a blanket. No medicine. No food. He remembered telling her that God loved the poor. Yet above him, in vaults beneath St. Peter's, lay enough gold to feed continents. What did those words mean now? The cardinal's shouting blurred into background noise. Denial. Confession. Delay. Their voices rose and fell. Yet, none carried conviction. Fear had stripped them of authority. Francis stood, the chamber stilled. He looked pale, his shoulders bowed by sleeplessness, but his eyes burned with something the others had not seen in years. Clarity. "I have listened," he said quietly. "I have prayed. I have heard the cries of the square, and I have heard the cries of history. Louder still." He lifted his gaze. We cannot erase truth. We cannot cage it. The vaults exist. The gold exists. The crimes exist. And the world knows. Gasps rippled. Benedetti surged forward. You cannot speak. So, to confess is to destroy the church itself. Francis turned to him, voice steady. No, Antonio, to hide it is what has destroyed us. The lie is the rot. The truth is the only medicine left. Silence swept the chamber. Some cardinals lowered their heads in shame. Others scowled, lips trembling with rage. But all of them knew the Pope had crossed a line. He was no longer speaking as the guardian of their institution. He was speaking as a man about to dismantle it. Outside, the chants grew louder, the square shaking with voices. Confess, confess, confess. The sound pressed through the walls, into the chamber, into their bones. Francis closed his eyes for a moment, whispering words none could hear. When he opened them again, his decision was already written on his face. And at last, the Pope knew he had to choose. Dawn rose grey and heavy over Rome. Clouds pressed low above the dome of St. Zinc, Peter's, as though heaven itself held its breath. Below, the square was already a sea of faces. Tens of thousands had gathered before the sun lifted its rim above the horizon. Old women in shawls clutched rosaries. Children sat on fathers' shoulders. Priests, nuns, workers, students, even atheists stood side by side. Some carried candles guttering in the breeze. Others held banners, painted in hurried strokes. Return what is not yours. Christ had no vaults. Confess. Television crews lined the rooftops, their lenses trained on the balcony. Reporters whispered, in dozens of languages. Across the world, screens flickered on. In Lagos, crowds filled bars and churches to watch. In Mexico City, families set up televisions in plazas. In Dublin, the pubs fell silent. In Kinshasa, people gathered around radios, straining for every word. Inside the palace, the air was taut. The Swiss guards stood rigid, but their eyes betrayed unease. Their halberds gleamed, yet none seemed eager to raise them. They had been trained to protect the Pope from assassins, not from the truth itself. In his chamber, Francis prepared alone. He chose not the white papal robes, but simple black. He removed the fisherman's ring from his hand. He set aside the golden cross. His secretary tried to protest. Francis silenced him gently. Today, I appear not as ruler of Christendom, but as a sinner who must speak. The man bowed his head and wept. When Francis stepped onto the balcony, the square exhaled as one. Silence fell, thick as stone. Even the pigeons circling the Basilica seemed to pause in their flight. Against the marble pillars, Francis looked small, a shadow in plain black. The cameras caught every tremor in his hands, every line etched by sleepless nights. He lifted his gaze. His voice cracked at first, but steadied as it carried into the waiting air. Children of God, he began, I stand before you not to defend, but to confess. A ripple moved through the crowd, gasps, muffled cries, murmurs of disbelief. Some crossed themselves. Others clutched each other's hands tighter. Francis drew breath. For centuries, this church has claimed to serve Christ. Yet beneath these altars lay vaults of gold, taken not from sacrifice, but from suffering. 10,473 tons. Every ounce stolen from Africa. Every ounce a betrayal. The words crashed like thunder. People cried out. Some fell to their knees. A priest in the crowd tore his collar and dropped it in the dust. Francis' voice grew firmer, sharper. We told you poverty was holy, while we hoarded the wealth of nations. We told you suffering was redemptive, while we profited from your chains. We blessed slave ships. We melted crowns. We called theft God's work. He gripped the railing, knuckles white, holding himself steady against the enormity of the truth. His eyes swept the faces below, eyes filled with tears, rage, hope. "This is not Christianity," he said. "This is criminality, and it ends today." The square erupted. Some wailed, some shouted, some stretched hands toward him as though reaching for absolution. Cameras broadcast the scene in real time. In Accra, people cheered and lit bonfires. In Madrid, church bells rang in protest and in grief. In New York, anchors stammered, struggling for words. In Nairobi, old men embraced in tears, whispering, "We were right all along." Francis raised a folder, its pages trembling in the morning breeze. Here are the records, the numbers, the crimes, the truth. No longer hidden, no longer ours. From this moment, we return every ounce, every artifact, every memory to Africa. Immediately, the crowd roared, a sound that shook the ground itself. Strangas Hogel wept, lifted children high, yet in the palace behind him, rage festered. Cardinals shouted, some demanding guards drag Francis away. "He is destroying us." Benedetti screamed. But the guards did not move. Their loyalty had shifted no longer to an institution, but to the truth spoken before their eyes. Francis' voice softened. "And I resign as Pope. I am unworthy to lead after such betrayal. From this moment, I am only Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a man who failed to prevent the sins of his house. I beg your forgiveness." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then slowly, à champ rose, hesitant at first, "Forgive, forgive, forgive." It grew, spreading across the square until tens of thousands thundered it together. Forgiveness and grief tangled into one. Francis stepped back. His knees trembled, but his heart felt lighter. The weight of centuries no longer pressed so heavily. He looked up at the crucifix above the square, and for the first time in years, he felt the faint warmth of grace. Below, the crowd surged with tears, cheers, and prayers. Around the globe, his words replayed in endless loop. In Africa, church bells rang in triumph. In Europe, many fell silent, unable to face the reflection in the mirror. In America, commentators declared an era had ended. History had turned. The church would never be the same again. The echoes of Francis's confession had barely faded when the world convulsed. The Pope's resignation, broadcast live, replayed endlessly across televisions, phones, radios. His words became fire, spreading faster than any decree Rome had ever issued. In St. Peter's Square, shock turned quickly to storm. Many wept openly, clutching one another. Some cheered, raising fists, crying out, "Justice, justice." But not all were ready for redemption. A faction of furious traditionalists surged toward the Basilica gates, waving crucifixes like weapons. "The Pope has been deceived," they shouted. "The church is not guilty." Swiss guards moved quickly, blocking the steps, their faces grim. For the first time in centuries, they were not defending the Pope, but the people from the fury of his own priests. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. The College of Cardinals split into warring camps. Benedetti screamed hoarse, calling Francis a traitor. "He has delivered us to the wolves. He has destroyed 2,000 years of glory in 1 hour." Others demanded emergency conclave, while progressives wept in relief, whispering prayers of gratitude that at last truth had been spoken aloud. Some cardinals spoke of escape, plotting flights out of Rome before mobs arrived. Others tore off their robes, declaring they could not wear garments woven with blood. The Apostolic Palace, once a seat of order, had become a battlefield of whispers, rage, and despair. Beyond the Vatican walls, the city of Rome erupted. Italians filled the streets, Newspapers clutched in their hands, voices echoing against ancient ruins. Some demanded arrests. Others demanded forgiveness. Yet none doubted any longer. The ledgers Francis had confirmed were truth carved in gold. Markets collapsed within hours. The euro fell like a stone. The dollar trembled. Traders screamed into telephones as screens bled red. Credit Suisse, already unstable, suspended trading. Deutsche Bank's stocks plummeted. The Bank of England called emergency meetings, its governors pale as ghosts. Investors fled to anything but currency, backed by the Vatican's tainted gold. In Paris, the president's address was shaky. This is a Catholic crisis, he insisted, but his ministers knew better. France Museum, its banks, its colonial past, all were tangled in the same sins. In London, politicians argued in Parliament, the Speaker forced to call order over the cries of MPs, demanding the Crown reveal the origins of its own jewels. Across the Atlantic, Washington fell into stunned silence. Analysts confirmed what officials feared. If Vatican gold had been collateral, then even the Federal Reserve might be complicit. Television anchors stumbled, their voices cracking. The foundation of our global economy may have rested on stolen blood gold, but nowhere was the reaction as fierce as Africa. In Lagos, churches overflowed, not with worship, but with protest. Priests tore off vestments mid-sermon, leaving altars bare. Crowds sang freedom songs older than colonialism itself. In Accra, people flooded Independence Square, waving Ghanaian flags alongside banners that read, "Our ancestors are vindicated." In Nairobi, bells rang in triumph, drowning out the city's morning noise. And in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim addressed his nation from a balcony of his modest palace. He did not gloat. His words were calm, steady, but each syllable cut like iron. Brothers and sisters of Africa, the Pope has confessed, the gold they stole will return. But remember, the gold is only metal. What matters is the truth. For centuries they told us we were poor. Now the world knows we were robbed. The lie is broken. The crowd below answered with thunderous chants. Ibrahim raised a hand for silence. We must be ready. The world will resist. Banks will threaten. Nations will panic. But Africa will not be silent again. Our ancestors cry from the soil, justice has begun. That night, fires lit the skies across the continent. Not fires of war, but of celebration. Drums beat in villages. Cities pulsed with song. Elders whispered to children, "Remember this day, the day the church confessed." But while Africa rejoiced, Europe trembled. Cathedrals emptied. Priests resigned. Seminaries reported silence in their halls. In Dublin, a bishop walked into a crowd, laid down his mitre, and whispered, "Forgive us." In Madrid, nuns marched through streets, demanding their order divest of every possession. The church, as the world had known it, was unraveling in real time. Yet in the quiet corners of power, darker schemes formed. Benedetti and his allies swore the fight was not over. If Francis has abandoned the church, he hissed to his followers, then we must save it ourselves. Rumors of a counter-conclave began to spread, a plot to elect a rival pope who would renounce Francis's confession and rally the faithful. For a moment, the Vatican seemed a tinderbox, ready to ignite between those who demanded repentance and those who would rather burn the truth than bow to it. And in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim prepared his next move. The confession had shattered faith, but the aftermath shattered power. Across Europe, the dominoes began to fall. In Paris, the French government called an emergency cabinet meeting. Ministers pored over documents, realizing the Vatican's gold had been used as collateral for loans to French banks for decades. The economy was on edge. Stock markets wavered. Insurance companies panicked, and citizens rushed to withdraw savings. London faced a similar upheaval. The Bank of England convened behind closed doors, its governors pale with dread. Letters between Vatican officials and British bankers from the 19th and 20th centuries surfaced online, showing the Crown's complicity in laundering stolen African gold. The pound wavered against the euro. Citizens demanded answers. Protesters gathered outside the Bank of England, waving photographs of looted crowns and melted artifacts. Rome was in chaos. Cardinals fought in council chambers, some urging defiance, others advocating total transparency. Swiss guards had never seen such division. Some refused to guard doors, fearing for their own loyalty. The Pope's chambers were empty. Francis had retreated, letting history unfold. The UN Security Council convened an urgent session. African nations demanded reparations and immediate restitution. Russia, China, and the United States issued statements emphasizing accountability and transparency. The world was listening, and the Vatican had no choice but to respond. In Washington, financial analysts calculated the potential fallout. If the Vatican's gold was returned, the European banking system could collapse. Trillions in collateral were suddenly questioned. The Federal Reserve quietly began contingency planning. Headlines screamed, "The Vatican confesses global economy shaken." Meanwhile, Africa mobilized. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim called his cabinet into a secure room. Advisors from every nation of the continent participated via encrypted video. Detailed maps and inventories were spread across the table. Dr. Aminata Sawado, historical advisor, spoke first. "We know exactly what has been taken. We have lists, photographs, and documents from the Vatican leak. We can distribute the gold fairly, according to historical theft, population, and development needs." Captain Marcus Zongo, head of security, added, "We will need the largest security operation in history. The world is watching." Ibrahim nodded. His face was calm, almost serene. "We do not seek revenge. We do not gloat. We act to restore justice. Africa's future will not be built on anger, but on righting the wrongs centuries in the making." Across Europe, fear turned to desperation. German banks froze transactions, as reports suggested that portions of their reserves were linked to Vatican-backed loans. Italy faced political upheaval as citizens demanded accountability from their government for enabling centuries of theft. Spain, Belgium, and Portugal struggled with mounting public outrage as their own colonial histories were scrutinized. In New York, Wall Street analysts debated the fallout. The exposure threatened not only the Catholic Church, but also the stability of global financial markets. Multi-billion-dollar portfolios suddenly held tainted assets, and investors panicked. International organizations called for emergency audits. The media dubbed it the Vatican Gold Crisis. Every major news outlet covered it continuously. Social media amplified outrage. Hashtags like "Return Our Gold," "Justice for Africa," and "Vatican Exposed" trended worldwide. Young people, especially in Europe and the Americas, began organizing rallies, demanding transparency and historical accountability. Through it all, Ibrahim remained calm. He did not release another photograph or document immediately. He waited, letting the pressure build, letting Europe and the world realize the magnitude of what had been stolen and hidden for centuries. In Ouagadougou, plans for restitution advanced. African nations began organizing logistics, secure transport of gold, verification teams, allocation protocols. Schools and universities were drafted into cataloging artifacts. Lawyers worked on international agreements for legal transfer. Economists began designing how to incorporate the returning wealth into stable, continent-wide currency systems. Ibrahim addressed his cabinet again. "History has given us this opportunity. We must seize it. But with discipline, every decision must be precise. We are caretakers, not conquerors. The world is watching. How we act will define a new era for Africa and for humanity." And then, just as Europe and the world braced for the next wave, Ibrahim's team made a discovery that no one anticipated. Dr. Sawado held up a set of documents. "Mr. President," she said, voice tense. "It's not just the Vatican. The Swiss banks have been involved for centuries. They've been laundering gold stolen from Africa through the Vatican. Entire nations' wealth, moved under the guise of religious immunity. We have the ledgers. And it's far more extensive than we imagined." Ibrahim's eyes narrowed. "Prepare it for release. Let the world see the full network. Not just the church, but the financial empire that enabled it." The room fell silent. Everyone understood the magnitude. The exposure would shake Switzerland, Europe, the financial world itself. Europe had thought it could weather the Pope's confession, but now the crisis was about to deepen. And in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim smiled slightly. The next chapter was about to begin. The Vatican's confession had shattered faith, but the Swiss connection shattered the illusion of security. In a secure office in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré's team huddled around a table, cluttered with documents. Dr. Aminata Sawado placed a thick folder in front of him. "Mr. President," she said, voice too. "These ledgers are from the 1930 seconds onward. They show transactions between the Vatican and Swiss banks Credit Suisse, UBS, Julius Baer. Gold stolen from Africa was moved through these accounts, laundered under religious immunity." Ibrahim leaned forward. His eyes scanned the pages, the rows of numbers and annotations, the coded references to kingdoms and shipments. Every bar of gold, every artifact, meticulously recorded. "They used the church as a front," he said quietly. "History's largest laundering operation. Entire nations' wealth funneled through the Vatican to Swiss vaults. And they thought it would stay secret." The team studied photographic evidence. Vaults in Geneva, Basel, Zurich gold from Congo, Ethiopia, Ghana, all traced through Vatican accounts. Audio recordings from the 1990 seconds surfaced, bankers laughing as they described the process. One voice said chillingly, "As long as the gold passes through the Pope's hands, it becomes holy. Holy gold cannot be stolen. Can it?" Laughter followed. "This is worse than the Vatican alone," said Captain Marcus Zongo. "It implicates the entire Swiss financial system." Ibrahim's jaw tightened. Then Switzerland must face its reckoning. 2. Within hours, the documents were released to the press. The world froze. Credit Suisse, UBS, Julius Baer, once symbols of stability, were suddenly centers of scandal. Headlines screamed. Swiss banks and the Vatican. Century of African gold laundering exposed. Financial news anchors stumbled, unable to convey the magnitude. Social media exploded. Citizens everywhere demanded transparency. Initially, Swiss officials tried denial. The Federal Council held a press conference, asserting that all transactions were legal for their time. They insisted secrecy had been standard practice, that no wrongdoing had occurred. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. Ledgers, photographs, and recorded statements left no room for doubt. Protests erupted in Zurich, Geneva, and Bern. Young people, furious at the revelation, demanded that the banks open all accounts and return stolen wealth. Traditional institutions, long seen as untouchable, were no longer immune. Meanwhile, financial markets convulsed. Trillions of Swiss francs fled the country. Depositors panicked. Investment funds tied to Swiss banking assets collapsed. The euro and the dollar, partially backed by Vatican gold, wavered. European governments scrambled to contain the panic. Politicians faced calls for immediate resignation. Even in New York, analysts reassessed portfolios. The exposure threatened global collateral networks. Banks that had lent money against Vatican-backed gold faced bankruptcy. Every major economy felt tremors from the Swiss scandal. Through it all, Ibrahim remained calm. He had anticipated the chaos. This was not just about gold, it was about accountability. By exposing the Swiss, he forced the world to confront centuries of complicity. In Geneva, President Ignacio Cassis convened an emergency council. We operated within international law. He insisted. These historical transactions are legitimate, but the room trembled with doubt. Staff whispered, "What if the world demands restitution?" Ibrahim did not release every detail immediately. He knew timing was power. Instead, he sent hints, select photographs, snippets of ledgers, recordings of Swiss bankers discussing laundering strategies. Each release created shockwaves. Each release tightened the noose of accountability. Prepare the full dossier. Ibrahim told Dr. Sawado, the world must understand the scope, not just the church, not just the banks, but the system they created together. Let no one deny it. Let no nation claim ignorance. We reveal everything at once. And in Europe, the realization sank in. The Swiss financial fortress, long thought, untouchable, was built on centuries of exploitation. Customers withdrew funds, multinational corporations audited holdings, and governments faced the dawning truth that their economies were entwined with theft. The Swiss government faltered under the pressure. Economic analysts predicted collapse if restitution demands were enforced. Trillions in liquidity evaporated within days. The shockwaves rippled through every continent. Ibrahim leaned back, surveying the room. This is only the beginning. The Vatican confessed. Europe panicked. Now the enablers are exposed. The system is crumbling, and the world must witness justice. Not just for gold, but for history itself. His advisors nodded. They understood. The Swiss connection was the key. The dominoes of global accountability were set. The countdown to restitution, transparency, and irreversible change had begun. And with it, Ibrahim prepared the final release. The documents, the evidence, the incontrovertible proof of centuries of collusion soon. The entire world would know. The Swiss banks, the Vatican, Europe itself, all would have to answer. The countdown to global justice had begun. The revelation of Vatican gold, now intertwined with Swiss banks, did not simply ripple across the world, it shattered it. In Paris, finance ministers met behind closed doors. Credit Suisse and UBS's involvement forced immediate asset freezes. Multinational banks convened emergency sessions. The euro wavered like a pendulum, threatening the continent's entire economy. Citizens flooded ATMs. Streets filled with protests, banners reading, "Return Africa's gold," and "Justice over profits." Some tore up bank statements. Others set fire to papers, symbolizing centuries of stolen wealth. London's Bank of England was in panic. Records, letters, and vault inventories exposed decades of complicity. Parliament convened emergency sessions, questioning the Crown's role in laundering African gold through Vatican channels. Investors withdrew billions. Trading halted. Markets trembled. Across the Atlantic, New York faced an unprecedented financial shock. Wall Street analysts pored over Vatican and Swiss accounts, tied to the Federal Reserve. Trillions in collateral evaporated from portfolios almost overnight. The dollar, long the world's reserve currency, faltered. Treasury officials scrambled to reassure the public, but the cracks were visible. Financial institutions scrambled to evaluate the provenance of their assets. Mutual funds, insurance companies, hedge funds all faced immediate collapse. China acted swiftly. President Xi called an emergency summit of G20 nations via teleconference. The world must recognize the historical theft of Africa and the financial systems built upon it, he said. Beijing proposed a new global financial framework, with African nations at its center, backed by returning gold and historical assets. Russia demanded the cancellation of foreign debts tied to stolen gold. Both nations saw opportunity in Europe's destabilization. In the European Union, governments scrambled. Spain faced protest, demanding reparations. Belgium and Portugal were called to account for colonial loot funneled through Vatican accounts. Germany's finance ministry convened late-night sessions to prevent bank collapses. Economists warned that trillions of euros were at risk. Citizens demanded transparency, demanding governments admit complicity. Meanwhile, Africa prepared for its unprecedented moment of justice. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré convened a secure council with advisors from all African nations. Detailed maps and ledgers of stolen gold and artifacts covered every table. Dr. Aminata Sawadu outlined distribution strategies, ensuring fairness according to historical theft, population, and development needs. Every shipment must be accounted for, she said, every ounce verified, every artifact documented. Captain Marcus Zongo nodded. Security is paramount. The world will be watching, and many will attempt to interfere. Ibrahim looked at them all. We do not retaliate, he said. We restore, we rebuild, but we act decisively. Every nation, every institution must know that exploitation ends today. Africa will reclaim what is rightfully ours, not with anger, but with justice. News outlets broadcast his words globally. The world listened, captivated, and horrified. Markets fell, governments panicked, and ordinary citizens realized the enormity of what had been hidden for centuries. History, wealth, and faith had been manipulated, and now the truth was indisputable. Financial systems around the globe trembled. Banks in Switzerland and Europe experienced mass withdrawals. The dollar's credibility sank, and markets shifted to alternative currencies, including gold-backed African instruments that Ibrahim had proposed. Insurance companies recalculated liabilities, realizing they were inadvertently insuring centuries of stolen wealth. The moral and financial reckoning went beyond Europe. Universities, museums, and cultural institutions faced demands for restitution. Archaeological evidence, artifacts, and historical records suddenly became matters of international dispute. Every institution tied to colonial wealth and religious complicity was forced to confront its role. Yet, amid the chaos, Africa stood ready. Distribution centers were prepared. Logistics plans were mapped. Economists and historians collaborated to ensure that every piece of gold, every artifact, every ounce of stolen wealth would not be lost again. For Africa, this was not merely wealth, it was dignity, knowledge, and history restored. In Rome, the Vatican's walls echoed with tension. Cardinals bickered, guards shifted uneasily, and Francis observed from a distance, aware that history had surpassed any control he could exert. Some cardinals suggested defiance, others urged immediate restitution. But the die was cast. The truth had been revealed, and the world demanded justice. Ibrahim's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the global upheaval. He had anticipated the shockwaves, prepared for the panic, and now, as governments and financial institutions scrambled to maintain control, he considered the next steps. The exposure of Swiss banks was monumental, but it was only the beginning. The world was at a precipice, trembling on the edge of moral, financial, and historical collapse. Every nation, every bank, every citizen confronted the evidence of centuries-long theft. And while the world reeled, Ibrahim planned the next move. The first convoys rolled out at dawn. Vatican City, once a fortress of gold, now echoed with emptiness. Security teams, journalists, and African delegates assembled for the historic event. Camera crews recorded every moment. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their blades chopping the morning light. Inside the vaults, The gold gleamed like the sun trapped in metal, 10,000 tons, meticulously catalogued. Each bar, each artifact tagged, verified, and photographed. The labels bore the names of kingdoms, empires, and cities. Congo, Ghana, Ethiopia, Mali. Each item was a testament to centuries of theft. Cardinal O'Brien, chosen to oversee the Vatican's dissolution, stood quietly as he handed the first shipment to African representatives. His hands shook, not with fear but with awe. "May this gold serve those from whom it was taken," he murmured. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré watched via live transmission. His office hummed with activity. Economists, historians, security chiefs, and logistics coordinators working in unison. The African Heritage Restoration Fund had been activated. Every item transported was tracked with GPS. Every ton weighed. Every artifact recorded. Transparency was paramount. The first plane departed. Gold bars and ceremonial objects secured in reinforced containers. Across the continent, nations prepared to receive shipments. Nigeria, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Congo, Kenya each built temporary vaults, museum, and secure storage facilities. Universities were assigned to catalogue the items, ensuring academic access to historical evidence. The symbolism was overwhelming. Children waved flags at airport runways. Elderly citizens wept openly. Leaders bowed in gratitude, not to the Pope, but to justice itself. News outlets broadcast live footage, the captions scrolling like a prophecy, finally fulfilled. Africa received centuries of stolen wealth. Justice in motion. Yet the operation was not without tension. Security threats loomed. Private militias attempted to intercept convoys. Governments scrambled fighter jets and patrol boats. Ibrahim's security chief, Captain Marcus Zongo, coordinated convoys with military precision. "No item leaves the continent without verification," he said, voice firm. The first public ceremony occurred in Accra. Gold bars were unloaded in the presence of diplomats, journalists, and citizens. As the last crate was placed in secure vaults, the crowd erupted. Drums beat, horns sounded, and the air filled with cries of triumph. Ibrahim addressed the people. "Today, we reclaim more than gold. We reclaim our dignity. We reclaim our history. For centuries, our wealth was hidden, our progress stolen. Now, we begin to rebuild." His voice was steady, firm, carrying across the crowd. Each shipment told its own story. A golden crown from Congo, melted and recast centuries ago, returned to Kinshasa. Jewelry belonging to Ethiopian royalty, confiscated and hidden during Italian invasions, was restored. Even gold teeth, removed from enslaved children, were catalogued as painful reminders. Universities took on special roles. Students documented every artifact. Professors lectured on historical context. Archaeologists analyzed remnants of ceremonial objects. The process was painstaking, but necessary. Africa's history, once erased or distorted, was being restored piece by piece. Media coverage emphasized the human element, images of elders touching crowns, children holding ceremonial jewelry, and leaders solemnly inspecting gold bars circulated worldwide. In each photograph, the stolen wealth was not just metal, it was memory, identity, and justice materialized. Yet amidst celebration, challenges remained. Some nations had to negotiate claims when borders had changed over centuries. Disputes arose over allocation, prompting diplomatic councils. Ibrahim mediated each issue, ensuring fairness while maintaining focus on the larger purpose. Economic plan followed quickly. Returned gold would back new currencies, fund infrastructure, and support education and healthcare initiatives. Every bar accounted for, every artifact preserved, every historical injustice acknowledged. Africa was preparing to transform, not just symbolically, but materially. In Rome, the Vatican remained eerily silent. Empty vaults echoed with history's weight. Journalists walked through abandoned corridors, documenting the final moments of centuries-long concealment. The church's symbols remained, but the wealth, the heart of its power, had departed. By the end of the first week, convoys had reached multiple African capitals. Faces in the crowds displayed an unusual mixture of joy and sorrow. Joy at justice, sorrow at centuries of suffering that could never be erased. Leaders addressed their people with gratitude and solemn promises. Ibrahim knew this was only the beginning. Returning the gold was not merely an act of restitution. It was the foundation of a broader, moral, and societal reckoning. Africa would rebuild its economies, institutions, and cultural heritage, but the scars of theft and exploitation would demand vigilance, education, and preservation. As the last shipment of the day departed, Ibrahim looked at the monitors, observing gold being secured in Mali, Senegal, and Ethiopia. He knew the world was watching. Every step, every bar, every artifact had to be transparent. The story could not be rewritten this time. And while the gold returned, a deeper reckoning awaited the truth of stolen knowledge, stolen art, stolen history, and stolen dignity that still required correction. 20 years had passed since the Vatican confessed Africa, once portrayed as poor and dependent, now stood as the world's beacon of justice and innovation. Cities that had been slums thrummed with life. Hospitals, schools, and universities rose on foundations built with returned gold. Children walked streets lined with libraries and cultural centers, learning the true history of their ancestors. The African Heritage Restoration Fund had evolved into a continental institution managing both wealth and knowledge. Its influence surpassed that of the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF combined. Every nation's share of gold had been allocated based on historical theft, population, and development needs, and now it powered education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Roads that once were mere dirt tracks became highways, connecting cities. Rural villages were electrified, and water systems once destroyed by colonial extraction projects now flowed freely. Ibrahim Traoré, aged but vigilant, oversaw the final phases of institutional reform. His daily routines were modest: morning walks through Ouagadougou, meetings with economists, historians, and civic leaders. Yet his influence was immense. He had transformed stolen wealth into a shared asset for progress, ensuring no single person or group could hoard power again. Africa's universities became global centers of innovation. Scientific breakthroughs, once suppressed or stolen, flourished. Researchers shared discoveries freely, from herbal cures for chronic diseases to renewable energy technologies derived from traditional African engineering principles. Africa exported knowledge, not just resources, reversing centuries of exploitation. The cultural renaissance was equally remarkable. Museums and galleries across the continent displayed recovered artifacts, crowns, jewelry, ceremonial items, and historical manuscripts. Each item carried a plaque telling its story: where it had been taken, how it had been hidden, and how it had returned. Children learned that the continent had never been poor. It had been robbed. Languages once erased were restored, bringing back centuries of literature, oral history, and philosophy. Traditional music, dance, and crafts flourished. Global audiences celebrated African culture in festivals, concerts, and exhibitions. Meanwhile, Europe had undergone a profound reckoning. The revelation of centuries of theft and exploitation forced governments to re-evaluate history, Education curricula changed, teaching the full extent of colonial exploitation and complicity in religious and financial institutions. Churches and museums, stripped of ill-gotten wealth, became public spaces or cultural centers, many funded by Chinese and international support, now directed to African nations. Communities embraced humility and historical accountability. Financial systems worldwide were restructured. Swiss banks, after massive asset withdrawals and audits, became transparent institutions with strict ethical regulations. European banks reorganized under scrutiny, and global financial institutions incorporated restitution clauses into their operations. Africa's new gold-backed currency, the Ubuntu, became a stable alternative, influencing global trade and investment. The flow of capital, once tied to centuries of exploitation, was redirected toward equitable growth and sustainability. Pope Francis, living quietly in a small monastery in Rome, witnessed the transformation from afar. He reflected daily on the consequences of his confession and resignation. Though he had abandoned power, he had helped catalyze a moral and historical reckoning. Francis frequently corresponded with Ibrahim, offering counsel when requested, yet respecting the autonomy of African leadership. His final years were spent in study, meditation, and service, humbled by the scope of what truth had unleashed. On the global stage, societies had shifted. Citizens demanded accountability. Corporations were forced to trace their assets, and countries had to confront their histories. Education emphasized moral responsibility and the consequences of exploitation. Histories of wealth accumulation were rewritten, acknowledging the role of stolen resources, colonization, and systemic injustice. Even spiritually, change was profound. Christianity had been reformed. Churches operated without vast wealth, focusing on community service, education, and charity. Faith became a personal and moral compass rather than a vehicle for accumulation or control. People across continents redefined belief, integrating historical truth with ethical action. Ibrahim, now in his twilight years, reflected on his life and choices. In his diary, he wrote, "The gold was only metal. The real treasure was knowledge, history, and dignity restored. The truth returned more than wealth. It returned our humanity." He had seen Africa rise, not by exploiting others, but by reclaiming what was theirs and using it wisely. At 90, as he prepared to pass leadership to a new generation, Ibrahim knew his legacy was secure. The continent had been reshaped, the world transformed, and the story of theft and restitution firmly documented. Young Africans no longer doubted their potential or their worth. They carried the knowledge that injustice could be confronted and corrected. And yet, Ibrahim understood that vigilance must continue. History had shown how quickly power could corrupt and how easily truths could be buried. The world would always require guardians of justice. He had restored wealth and knowledge, but he had also set the precedent. Accountability is eternal, and the work of safeguarding truth never ends. The Vatican's vaults remained empty, now open to tourists who walked through in silence, learning about centuries of theft. European and American visitors left humbled, some in tears, others in deep reflection. African visitors walked with pride, seeing the tangible return of history, dignity, and power. Children studied maps tracing gold routes, understanding how it had traveled across oceans, hidden in plain sight. Scholars published papers on the restored languages, medicinal knowledge, and innovations once thought European but proven African in origin. Africa's place in global history was finally recognized. The world, once structured by exploitation, had shifted. Moral and economic power now rested in the hands of those who had been robbed. Justice had been restored, not by vengeance, but by courage, planning, and unwavering commitment to truth. And in the quiet moments, Ibrahim looked out over the continent he had helped restore, a faint smile crossing his face. The future was bright. The past had been judged. The present was just. The story of Africa's stolen gold, its restoration, and the rebirth of justice would echo through generations. A reminder that truth, when pursued relentlessly, reshapes the world.